Petroc from Disney Animation Studios.
Everybody hear me okay? You guys in the back? All right. We're waiting for that to turn over for you so you can see some images. So who here has heard of Disney? You guys cool with that? Excellent. Anybody here see Wreck-It Ralph? All right. Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to start off and I'm going to give you an overview of how we work at Disney as modelers and specifically how we use ZBrush. And then Dylan, one of our awesome character artists, is going to come up and open up ZBrush, show you some models, show you how we get to the final character on the screen. So I want to start off by just showing you what we're going to be talking about and talking about how we create characters at Disney. It's a process that's really evolved over the past few years. And if any of you guys know my art, it's very different than what you might expect a Disney artist to create. They do a lot of realistic character work. But there's a reason why I work at Disney. And there's a reason why that connection has happened between Disney and my art. And that really is because Disney focuses on story. And that's what I like to do with my art. It's all about story. I wanted to show you this because we often get wrapped up in what we do in this industry by looking at other CG artists. But there are other art forms out there that focus on stories. So here's a photographer, Gregory Crutzen. Awesome work. You don't know what that story is, but it's story-driven. So I encourage you guys to kind of look outside that box of CG to find other areas of inspiration. Looking at these photos, same thing. It's all story-driven. Just some cool, beautiful work out there that relates back to what we do as artists at Disney and why we use ZBrush. So this is the feature animation building, the hat building, as we call it, from Mickey Sorcerer Hat here. And I'm a model supervisor in what's called a modeling department SDL. So at Disney we have a new paradigm where we have leaders of each department, and together we work through problems and issues and best practice workflows, and we try to plan 10, 15, 20 years ahead so that we as a team of artists can all orchestrate how these characters behave and how the world's developed. One of the biggest things we do when we're working with that is this design philosophy. Has anybody heard of this one before? The smaller is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. This is something you could not get to before ZBrush. This is something that is part of your creativity, it's part of your design process. The interesting thing is, this never happens in nature. That it always happens in nature, right? These are design principles that we're not making up. We're not pulling this stuff out of thin air. If you look at this pattern on this leaf, relative to this stick on that same tree, there's a natural relationship there. That's the design principle. That's a design principle that will carry through to all our characters and environments, and we're going to show you some of that today, and why these fundamental design principles are so important. Anybody have this as a kid? Remember this thing? Pretty badass, right? So you take one head, one torso, and one set of legs, and you mix and match that crap all up, and then you make this character, right? That's the opposite of what you want to do. That's the opposite of what we want to do. We want everything to relate. We want a reason and a rationale behind these creative decisions that we're making. I'm going to jump in here. Prep and Landing was a TV short we did. And looking at these characters, if you want to be a character artist at Disney, and I think this transcends to any other studio, this is a big thing in what we do. Thinking back to that idea, the smaller is to the greater as the greater is to the whole. There's a whole lot of that going on in here, and it doesn't smack you over the face. If you look at this guy, they're both the same character, right? They're both kind of a nerdy tech guy. We don't have any of those here, by the way. But looking at this guy overall, look at these curves and these rounds of that nose and how that's echoing this shape of the head, right? Look at this curve on the hat compared to this guy who's much stricter and more rigid and refined. Look at these sharp creases that are happening. Everything down to the blotch of blush on his cheek. These are drawings by Bill Schwab, by the way. He's a phenomenal character artist at Disney. Looking at the difference between those two things, that's your job as a character artist at Disney, to pick those things out and accentuate them and take that character design to the next level. Same thing with the entire body. We have this idea of appeal at Disney, and it's a very simple idea. We put up drawings and we show to Lasser, we show to the directors, and we have a lot of reviews. And someone will say, I find that drawing or that sculpt more appealing than the other. And essentially all that's saying, it's a nice way of saying, I like that one better and this one sucks. Or, I like that one better than this one. It's a great way to do it, but this is something you guys want to infuse in your art. No matter what you're doing, video games, live action, anything else, you want to have appeal. And this is just the dictionary definition of it. This is something we strive for. And Dylan's going to be really talking you through that and how we actually develop it in ZBrush. The interesting thing at Disney is that we don't just have directors, we have directors who are also animators or character designers. So when you're showing your work to these guys to review, you're not showing someone who doesn't have any context here. You're showing some of the best character designers in the world and trying to get buy-off from them. So it makes it very interesting from day to day. Something a lot of people don't talk about is environments. In ZBrush, you typically think about it as characters. You think of Disney and the characters. All those same philosophies apply to what we do in the environments. Thinking back to the smaller is to the greater. So we had these 3 different worlds, right, in Wreck-It Ralph, and they each have their own form language. Right? This is something we try to infuse in that design throughout this entire process. So each one is defined, and then we try to transfer those and translate them into the sculpts and the designs that we're working on. So these ideas are things that really weren't in play before ZBrush. It used to be that you would have a software, you would have a 2D artist, they would draw everything from every angle, you take a packet, you hand it off to a 3D modeler, and that's it. That's where the disconnect would happen. But now with things like ZBrush, where you can focus on creativity, focus on line and form and design, that's all gone. We all work together now, we iterate on these things in 3D to get to end results like this. So, but again, looking at that pattern, the smaller is to the greater, everything about this is squared off and relating back to that world. So a similar concept with Hero's Duty here. So all these triangles and the color palette, these are ideas that you always want to be thinking about when you're creating your own world, you're creating your own artwork. How do all these things relate together? Even down to the ships. And down to the effects. Some of the effects work, like the sparks and the things that splash, those all have to relate to that world as well. And we'll be looking at some examples of that in the near future. This is kind of a cool image of what's happening here. All these circles and soft shapes, a beautiful soft palette of colors. Always relating back to that larger idea. This is, an interesting thing. Right here, if any of you guys remember, this is a foil curtain, right? It's a curtain that's made out of crumpled foil. So I remember at the beginning it was just a curtain, and then the art director said, no, it has to be foil. So I thought, how the hell am I going to sculpt a foil draped curtain? So, and honestly, I could not have done that without ZBrush. But we ended up going in, sculpting all the form, and then decimating it down, just reducing those polygons to get the triangles in there, to get all that faceting that the art director was after. Then we were able to use ZBrush to push and pull and quickly work on the rhythms and gestures and the balance of straights and curves that we'll talk about more. So it really is an interesting and iterative process because of these kinds of tools. So again, more of those circles and shapes and patterns. And looking at the frosting, I never thought I would have had to sculpt frosting, right? But sure enough, there's a scene where the ship comes in and crash lands and the ground is made of frosting and it's got to tear through it and leave this trail of ripped frosting. Right? Without ZBrush, this would not have been possible. Or it would have been just a ridiculous pain in the ass. I do wish we would have had the new remesher when we did this, because we had to hand retopologize this, and I think it took about 5 days. Another artist, Johnny Kino, and I worked on this. And I did go back and hit the damn button just to see, and yes, it did do it in about 30 seconds. So thanks for being a year and a half late. This was another cool sculpt, and again, utilizing ZBrush. We went in, and Sammy and Brian Hinman and I worked on this, Sammy Segura, coming in and making this Coke bottle. This is the top of the Coke bottle at the very end when Ralph jumps down and punches in the Mentos. But we sculpted all this first in ZBrush, and then worked on this rock formation in ZBrush. And then this speaks a little bit to the iterative process of working with other downstream departments. Sculpted these forms in there and then sent it over to effects, and they filled it with all those Mentos. So we were able to art direct the global form, get the design working right, throw it over to the effects department, and then they added all these little Mentos and then worked on all the explosions and cool, crazy things that happened from there. So one last little example of an effect that was modeled in ZBrush. So everything in Niceland is about 8-bit square and simplified design. So Ralph smashes a cake when he's in Felix's apartment, and the cake splatters go everywhere. So we had to model these things, and a couple different artists worked on this. Tony Jung and Charlie, that guy, worked on this one. And here you can see the end result. So again, some very organic, very stylized, but very specific pieces of art that were created to go in here that you could not have done before. It would have been a heck of a lot harder. You could not have iterated. You would have really had to refine that 2D design and then settle on it, because you wouldn't have gotten a second chance. So our specific character development at Disney. A couple things that were interesting on Wreck-It Ralph, and different than our previous shows. On Walt, we knew that they were going to have quadrupeds with fur. That was going to be a challenge. On Rapunzel, had some really long hair, for obvious reasons. That was the big challenge. But on Ralph, it was the number of characters, the variety of different species that populate this world. How many characters were there? Just to give you an example, this is the number of characters we had on Walt, roughly 40, 45. This is the number of characters on Tangle, and then this is the number of characters on Wreck-It Ralph. So for those of you who are Tetris fans, you can see that we lost, actually, right there, but a lot of unique meshes. So again, that idea of iterating and working in a software that lets you work with the art director and become part of that entire team that creates this asset was quintessential. Could not have done it without it. Looking at these Nicelander guys, another thing we did was try to find efficiencies. So several of these are all the women and all the men are actually the same exact mesh. So we took those through the ZBrush process, developed them, and we'll show you a little bit about that later when Dylan sculpts on these things. But then we just added all the costuming to make them different and unique. It also helped that as part of the world logic and the story, they were meant to look similar because of the nature of the design. Another thing we can talk about a little bit is that this hair is actually sculpted form in ZBrush. So we went in and sculpted and designed those masses. And then this is just a texture applied to it. We wanted a very specific look for this world. So you don't want flowing natural hair on some of these guys that are very stylized and specific. The smaller is to the greater it is to the whole. A similar situation here, where we have some of the candy racers. So I think there were 3 different faces here that were utilized between all these characters. So same process, go into ZBrush, really work through them, get the appeal and the design the way we want it, and then go in and accessorize. This is a big win for downstream departments, for the look department, who are the people that put the textures on our characters, as well as the riggers. They put the skeletons in there, make them move. Huge savings by doing it that way. So, John C. Reilly. Phenomenal voice talent for Ralph. Sometimes we start the character design process before we have our voice talent identified. Sometimes we don't. In this case, they kind of had John C. Reilly in mind, but he wasn't solidified, wasn't tied to the show. So that's where they started 2D. And at this point, it's a blue sky process. The story is evolving. We knew he was a bad guy, but we didn't know he was a guy. It could be anything at this point. So these are some Mike Gabriel drawings. Could have had a giant fro for all we know. These are more drawings from Bill Schwab. You run the gamut. You try to do a lot of different design ideas. These are, by the way, I don't think they've been released to the public before, so that's kind of cool. You get to see them for the first time. But these things, they kind of happen with every show, and you run this range of trying to find out who this character is. And you're always presenting to the director, and you're getting notes, and the stories refining, and people are getting a better idea of what's happening. And then they started to hit on something with these giant hands. They know he was a bad guy, and he needed to smash stuff. Trying something even different to really accentuate that. But then at some point or another, the story evolved, and they said, we needed to be a man, a human. So they started going with this design. And now, at this stage, this is a ZBrush design sculpt by Chad Stubblefield. We bring in the modeling department. We don't separate our VizDev sculptors from our modeling sculptors. We have everybody on the same team do both. We feel that if you're a good design sculptor, then you're going to be a better production modeler. If you're a good production modeler, that's going to make you a better design sculptor. Those things feed together. So this is by Chad, and you can see it's really early. It is Ralph, but it's really not. It doesn't really look much like him at all, only has 3 fingers. And his personality, right, how he fits into the story is very different than where he landed. I actually have a quick animation test too. At this stage, we do a lot of different things with everyone in the studio. So we block in those models really fast. As Andrew Stanton says, you want to make your first mistake as soon as possible. That's a huge idea when you're trying to create a film. Screw up as early as possible because you know you're going to screw up, and then you got a lot more time to make it better. So let's see if we can get this to play. We take these models, even when they're not the right design yet, but we quickly put a rig in them, get them over to animation, get animation's input, because you're going to be seeing these things moving. That's where they really shine, right? So why spend 3 weeks looking at a design sculpt? It doesn't make sense. So this is an animation by Wayne Unton, if we can get it to play here. But you're going to see a rough design sculpt, a rough rig that's not even the character design. So here it is, based on that design sculpt you saw coming out of ZBrush. And again, we got this over to the animation department as quick as possible. Just to start exploring the character, to see how this guy is going to move. And that's extremely important when you're creating projects for a feature film, right? That is what the end goal is, to see this thing animated. So here's another design sculpt by Chad. It took it in a totally different direction. I think this might have come from a John note. So you try that, and then you sometimes the pendulum swings, right? So the pendulum swung back into more of the Ralph that we knew. But there's something very different about this guy. He's kind of, what am I doing in this movie? That's what he's saying. That's what this character is portraying. So it still wasn't quite landing with the directive. At that same time, we have some phenomenal 2D artists in the building. Obviously, these are drawings by Jin Kim. And he starts to look at things, the straights and curves of the design. Looking at how this line is very straight here, and very curved here. That's very important as a modeler at Disney. And I think as a designer in general, if you want to sculpt characters, this is an extremely important idea to wrap your head around. And I'll show you some examples in a little bit. So you're wrapping all those ideas together, you're getting input from 2D guys, from animation, from the design sculpt, and then you finally start to land on something that looks more like the Ralph we know, and it starts to hit. And then Chad and Bill worked together and created this design sculpt. And finally, you show the director, it's like, that's the character. That's who I want to be the star of this film. And it's because he's the bad guy, right? He's mad, he's pissed off. This is Ralph. Not this guy. What am I doing here, right? So those subtle differences that all relate back to story, this is story-driven design, is what makes the character work. So we touched quickly on that idea of straights to curves. We'll just blow through these real fast, but I highly recommend you guys to explore these further. But just looking at almost all great poses have a straight side and a curved side. Look at the straights over here and the curves over there and how those things balance. All beautiful art, and great characters throughout history have done that same thing, so it's something to just maybe start to wrap your head around. And it's all from anatomy, real-world anatomy. Looking at this straight side here to this curve and these hits that are happening over there. So software like ZBrush will let you get in there, utilize these fundamental ideas that you know about creating art, and just sculpt. Just do it. Just put these things into your work with someone else, and make it happen. Same thing in the faces, and again, Dylan's going to be showing some specific models that we've got, and we're going to show you how we develop these forms and what's important about this. We're looking at that idea of a straight to curve. I always thought these characters were so simple and easy, but the more you learn about it, the more you realize you have a hell of a lot more to go. They're so in-depth and complex. It's really been kind of a fascinating process for me working there. Again, just to show you this is J.C. Leindecker, straight to curve. Okay? So in great art, it's a repetition of a design fundamental that you want to be aware of. rhythms and gestures, something similar. Again, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys have used ZBrush. That's the power of it. You push and pull with that move brush. You use the transpose tool to pull these rhythms and gestures in there. That's what makes this thing come alive. And at Disney, as a modeler, that is your job. You need to capture this 2D essence into that 3D sculpt. So not very easy to do. This is from Loomis, Andrew Loomis. Again, these are not new ideas, right? I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen this before. Andrew Loomis book, fundamental or figure drawing for all it's worth. Just looking at those S-curves. Everybody's heard of S-curves, right? Or that idea. It's fundamental in making these things have a life. That's one of the real, genuine differences between a sculpt that you've all seen that just doesn't quite hit it and it doesn't speak to you and it's not alive, and something that transcends. So when we're doing that, we have to wrap all these ideas together and create a production mesh. And we do that back and forth between Maya and ZBrush. So we work in ZBrush because we love the way that you can read the form and you can show a director and they can read what's going on with the character, but we also work in Maya to make sure that it's going to be compliant with our pipeline. So it's a lot of back and forth, making sure that everything works exactly and specifically the way it needs to work for rigging. We also, since we're at the front of the pipeline, we deliver to rigging, to look, which is our texture department, to effects, to animation, almost everyone. To some degree, it's our responsibility to make sure that we're not going to screw them at a later date. So it's a lot of stuff to juggle. So you can see that entire mesh. We also did a couple compression expansion tests with Ralph and ZBrush. This was independent of the mesh, right? You want to see how this guy's going to be able to emote. You don't have a rig in it yet, so you just do these sculpt tests to see if it's going to work. We had a lot of back and forth with his jawline of all things and ended up changing it several times just to get the lighting to hit correctly on that jawline. And at that same time, we're taking that low-res mesh and throwing it over to animation and rigging the same way we did it before. It's funny, on Wreck-It Ralph, it probably took a week and a half to 2 weeks to do that process from design sculpt into first getting it into rigging and letting animation mess with it. Now it's a week. So from the start of design sculpt, we'll sculpt it. 5 days later, it's in the rig and they're doing this. They're posing it and checking these things out. The importance of this is that you need to know if the character can touch his hands over his head. Like simple, stupid things you wouldn't think about that are quintessential to telling a proper story. So you want to get into the animator's hands and get them to start to pose it to see if this model and design is going to work. And throughout this process, I'm sure a lot of you guys at other studios do this too, but they do a lot of scaling. They'll scale the head up or they'll scale the hand down per pose. So per shot, per pose, there's a lot of scaling that goes on to make it look as appealing as possible. And then we decide that if the animator is consistently scaling up that hand, let's say by 10%, we want to bake that back into the model. And so it's taking that input from everyone that's involved to really make this character work for our entire studio and our entire team. So I think these are awesome poses, by the way, from Wayne Hunton. Just simple, straightforward stuff. You can tell the rig it's a blocking rig. Nothing's really refined, but they're very telling. And we show these to the director. We get input all the way up. Just take everyone along for the ride and work as a team throughout. So I might have to skip some of the other videos. I might be running out of time, unless you guys really want to see them. And this is our look department. So we hand that same model off to look, and the guys that do our texture, they also work on the hair and some of these little frilly things down there. So we try to collaborate directly with them, get these things all working together. And then a similar process for Jane Lynch. So these are Minkyu Lee. The cool thing about this project was that there were so many different worlds and so many different design languages that it really stepped outside of the traditional paradigm of what a Disney film was. So we had a great time along with the biz dev artists. This is a Shi-Yoon Kim. Just blue sky. Every different kind of design you could think of. And I think these are phenomenal drawings, by the way. Kim. Some more Minkyu Lee. This is not your typical Disney drawing, but it's such a great time to be there now because so many different projects are bubbling up in-house. There's so many different things that I can't wait for you guys to see that are just as unique and different as Wreck-It Ralph was. So it's really a great time to be a part of that process. This was a cool little thing where in the beginning, Calhoun was going to come in attached to this little flying apparatus and was going to drop her off. And then we started to land on that character, but it wasn't quite hitting, so then they threw it over to Glenn Keane, who's a phenomenal animator. Many of you guys have heard of him, but he really kind of focused in on who this character was, brought it to life. And then we did that same process. So this is a design sculpt by Tony Jones. And the other thing we try to do whenever possible at Disney is if you're a modeler and you're working on that design sculpt, we want you to take it through production because you already know it. You've had the history with that model. You really understand what all those balance of proportions, straights and curves, everything that really makes this thing sing, we've already got a history with. So I think Tony did an awesome job with this. And as a modeler, you're also in charge of all the costuming, so you need to throw all that in there because it informs the design. And this was all done in ZBrush. We had one more test animation. I'll pass up on that. The other awesome thing at Disney is that they are very transparent with their entire process, from initial conception of a new world, a new idea, all the way through to the final film. So they want you to be a better artist, they want you to do your own art, and they want you to go out there and teach other people. So the way I get to do it is through my own teaching master classes on the website. But we have a trainee program, and I would highly recommend you guys to apply for that. That's for students. I think if you're between your junior and senior year, you can apply for that trainee program. And I think there are on-site reviewing portfolios today. And then we also have something called the apprentice program. And that's where you come in and you're not on a production. I think it's if you've graduated recently and you've had 2 years experience or within 2 years experience, you can come in and we give you a project to work on just to see how you like the environment and see how you fit. You work with another team, and it's a really great way to introduce yourself to the studio. And then a lot of those folks end up staying on and then folding into our team and into production. And one of those folks was Dylan Ekren, who went through our apprentice program. And I think he is now going to show you guys some specific models from Wreck-It Ralph, do some sculpting, show you why we use ZBrush, why it's so important to our creative and collaborative process. And maybe while Dylan is setting up, I will take any questions that you guys have, if there are any questions. Yes? And so the question is, what perspective setting do we use in the window to make sure that our model is corresponding to the drawing, but really we want to make it correspond to the downstream production. So we set it at 70 for what it's worth, and then we try to eyeball it also, because it changes depending on how big the thing is. So, yep, that's a good question. Yes, sir?
My name is John Paul.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what other projects do you have coming in the future that are related to Wreck-It Ralph and how you relate to ZBrush and this and
That's a great question. So the question is, what projects do we have coming in the future and how do they relate to ZBrush? The answer to that question is upstairs with someone in HR and marketing. I can tell you that our next feature is coming out this fall. It's called Frozen. And the then following feature that Dylan and I are actually both working on is called Big Hero 6. And that is based on a somewhat obscure Marvel property about a team of superheroes. And they will both utilize ZBrush.